presentation. Let's see. Yeah, so a couple of housekeeping things. I'm Caleb Porchot. I'm the creator and lead developer of Landscape, and with me today also is Michael Madole, my partner in crime.
Hello.
Able to answer any questions via chat while I'm going through this. If you have a microphone, please mute it during the presentation. That just helps everybody hear better. And then I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end, hopefully, for questions. So you can, like I said, chat for questions during the presentation or just hold them to the end. Okay, so let's get started. So thanks everybody for joining us today. Today we'll be talking about managing acquisitions with Landscape. A common question that we get is, what is the difference between a property and a project? Do I need to use one or both or none? And Michael came up with a really great analogy this morning that I'm going to share with you. I think it does a great job of explaining the difference. So land conservation is a lot like shopping for groceries. When you are going to go to the grocery store, you make a list of the things you're going to buy so that you don't forget when you get to the store. You may have a general sense of how much money you're going to spend or your budget. And your ultimate goal is to get a bunch of food back in your refrigerator. And so you take your list and your budget and you go to the store and you pick out your items, your food, and then you check out, you come back home and you put all the food in the refrigerator. So land conservation with Landscape is a lot like that. So the project is your list and your budget, your assets, so the title work, the surveys, the approvals, all the stuff that you're gathering up as you're going through that land acquisition process is the food. And then the property record is the refrigerator. So your goal at the end is to get all the assets into the property record. All the food goes into the refrigerator. And I think that does a really good job of explaining why you might use or what the difference and the distinctions are between those two things. Now, so I'm going to spend a lot of time today talking about projects, but I do want you to know at the outset, you don't actually, like if you don't want to deal with using Landscape to manage tasks or budget, you've got other ways to do that, or you don't do it at all, it doesn't matter to you, that's fine. You don't have to use a project ever if you don't want to. You can always just, if you get an appraisal, you can upload that appraisal to the property record, or title work, upload that to the property record. That's fine. If that's the way you want to work, that's simple. You can continue to do that. But what I'm going to show a lot of today is how a project can help you manage that process in a little bit more of a structured way so that you don't forget things. And it has some cool features that can keep you organized. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my screen here. Okay. So the way I thought I'd begin today is by going through the whole process. And actually, sorry, I'm going to turn off my video just to make sure we have full bandwidth here for everything. So, I'm going to start by going from start to finish with a project. So a common case may be that landowner calls up, says, hey, I want to protect my land, and you want to somehow get them into the system so that you can track that process from beginning to end. It may go nowhere, it may go somewhere, you don't know at this point, but you can use a project to help you manage that. So from the home screen here, I'm looking at my dashboard. I go to the start or create something new button over here on the left. Click that. I'm going to choose a project, which is the default here. And now it's going to walk me through a little bit of a wizard that will allow me to make some choices early on about what this project is all about. So I might want to give my project a name. So maybe this is really great acquisition. And there's three choices here for what is the purpose of the project. The first one is the one I'm going to use, which is, this is a new property. I don't know anything about it yet. This is good for tracking inquiries, like what our scenario is. potential acquisitions. Maybe you've identified the property. It wasn't just a landowner calling you. In any case where you're creating something from scratch, this is the choice that you want to pick. If you want to use a project for an existing property record, you've already created the property record, you can do that too. You just pick this second choice, and then it'll allow you to search for that existing record. I'm not going to use that option right now. So this is going to be a brand new property acquisition. And it'll say, do you want a different name for the property record? And I might call this really great property instead. And then it says, do I want to associate a contact with the property? I can choose not to, but let's say this was an inquiry and I know the landowners or landowners on the phone, I'm collecting their information, and maybe I want to add them as a landowner to this property right away. I could do a create new contact because chances are they aren't in the database. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to just pick an existing one so I don't have to add their address and email and all that information. So it's Joe Farmer. I'm going to say that they're the landowner. So I can tag them in various ways right here. Landowner is the one that I want to use. So I'm going to go to next. And now it's going to say, you have a couple options for templating that project. And there's a budget template and there's a task template. These templates are user defined. So in the settings, you can define these things ahead of time. An administrator of your account has to do that. Normal users that don't have access to settings can't do this. But then once they're created, they'll show up in this list. So let's say this is, I want the budget template for what a normal purchase conservation easement might be. And I might also want my purchase conservation easement task template as well. Again, both of these are defined in settings. So I'm just going to hit finish. It's going to do some work. It's going to take me to that new project record. So this is a project record. It's got a name at the top. The details here, it's got a status. You can have different types of projects. Acquisition happens to be the one that we want to use right now. Projects can have team leads. They can also have team members, multiple team members. It has a start date, completed date, and then it's got a little narrative description. If I want to type something in here, you can do that. These are, you can access all of these fields from reports later on. So if it's important to you to have a nice narrative description of the project, you can do that there. It gives me some dials that are going to be useful later as we start adding things. So one's for budget, one's for tasks. And then there's this goals section down here. A project has a goal, typically, right? So we want to acquire such and such a property. And generally, projects, I'd say 90% of the time, you're going to have one goal for your project. But what I want to point out is that you can, if you wanted to, have multiple goals in a project, and each goal will have all the same features that I'm going to talk about here in just a second. So if you have, for example, you want to manage a project that has maybe multiple acquisitions of different pieces of land, you can do that too. I'm not going to talk about that unless we have a lot of time at the end. So right now I'm just going to go with, we've got one goal. And the goal is tied to a particular target record. In this case, it's that property record that it created through the wizard. So it's connected to really great property. And that's important because that's how it knows where to put all the food at the end. So as I'm collecting my food in this project, really great property is the refrigerator at the end of it all. So that's important to keep that in mind. And then there's a bunch of stuff down here that I'm going to talk about in a second. So if this were an inquiry and I created this project because I just talked to the landowner, I may also know where the property is. I might go look it up. I might get a shapefile of it, import it. In any case, just to make this cooler and more usable, I might just pick a random spot here and say that I know where this property is. Maybe I don't have a shapefile for it. So I'm just going to hand draw a loosey-goosey boundary here. So now my property has an actual place on the land. And then I'm going to go into, I'm going to take a slight detour here and go into the property record for a second. And I can do that really quickly just by clicking on this go to source record. So you can see that now I'm in the property record. This is my parcel boundary that I've defined. I'm going to ignore all this stuff right now. And all I wanted to show you was maybe I want to put in my location information right away. I might know how big the property is. I might know what county it's in. And I can fill in those details by hand here if I want to. But the cool thing is that now that I've got this boundary, I can actually go up to this 3 dots menu and use this feature called Get Locations from Map. And it's going to say, how do you want to update the locations? I'm just going to say replace all because I don't have anything in there yet anyway. And then hopefully it's going to go out and tell me, oh yeah, I'm in Wisconsin, in this county, this town. I've got PLSS because I'm out west ish. And I've got congressional district information. So all that stuff got filled in for me automatically, which is really cool. And that's really all I wanted to do at this point. So now I'm actually just going to press back and get back to my project record. And we'll use that location information later. So that's why I wanted to get it in there. Okay, so now let's talk about what happens here now that I've got this project going. Well, you remember that I used some templates when I created the project. One of them was a budget template. So if I expand this budget section here, it will show me what that budget template threw in here for me automatically. So again, this is just a template. I defined it ahead of time. I called it, these are the things that I'll typically spend money on for this type of a project. I can remove these, I can change them, I can add new ones. I can always edit this after the fact, but this gives me a really nice starting place. So I'm not always starting from scratch and filling this in from scratch. So you can see that each budget line item has a name of the item, and then it has a category. And the category is really important. So these categories are defined again in settings. Your administrators can set these things up ahead of time. And this is how you'll end up tying your expenses back to the budget. So the categories have to match, and so that's why they're important. The categories can also define default costs. So my appraisals category happens to define the unit as count, and then the unit cost as 2,000. You can set that default stuff up in settings as well. But then it just multiplies across, and you can see that my budget then numbers are filling in from this column here. You can do things, for example, like staff time. So you can assign staff time to various labor categories. Again, these are all customizable. And then say, yeah, we think we're going to spend about 200 hours on this. It's going to cost us $50 an hour or whatever it is. And it gives you a really nice way of getting a staff time budget going as well. And then travel. So mileage, you can do mileage in a similar way. So you've got some unit cost for miles. You think you're going to travel X miles. So, pretty typical budgeting kind of stuff. So if I want to add something here, so I think I'm going to purchase this property. So I'm going to actually put a budget item in here for purchase price. So I'm going to click plus to add an item. I'm just going to type purchase price. I'm going to set the category. I have a category for capital cost, purchase price. That's what I'm going to use. And then I'm going to say 1. And I don't know what it is yet. So I'm going to just say $100,000. Now I've added that to my budget. And you can see that my total budget up here in the dial has gone up. My budget here has gone up. So this is my total budget for this project. Now, as I'm budgeting, I might also, because we're land trusts and we get our money oftentimes from grants and other funders, I might also want to start putting in some expectations for where I think this funding might come. And so it's important to make a distinction here. I'm not saying this is a funding check that I just got from somebody. This funding expectations section is where do I think the money might come from? And it allows me to create reports or have a sense basically of where I need to be budget-wise. So it's based on funding sources. So funding sources are the entity that is giving you the money. This list will allow you to search. So I can search for existing funding sources here. It will also allow me to create a new funding source if I want to do that. And then funding sources can be tied to specific funding agreements. So an agreement is basically one particular grant contract or loan contract or whatever it may be. So one source can have any number of agreements that you might have going on or have done in the past. And so this list will show you the list of all the agreements that are active for this particular source. Now, at the very, very beginning of a project, I may not know or have an agreement ready to go yet, right? Because this may still be planning, still is an inquiry, whatever. I might just say that I think that I expect to get, I don't know, $100,000 from this source. And so that's why you can just fill in what the expected amount is here. This agreement amount is going to be actually tied to data that comes from the agreement itself. So let's say I'm the person who's responsible for going out and actually getting the grants for this project. I can manage that here. If I click the Edit Source button and look at this funding source, there's a bunch of stuff in here, but I'm going to skip down to this funding agreements section. This funding agreement section is going to show you all the agreements for this funding source, whether they're active, how much they were for. So let's say I want to write a new grant for this to this funding entity for this project. I can add a new funding agreement, and I can call it my really great grant. Maybe I know the identifier, maybe I don't yet. The amount, let's say I'm going to ask for 100,000. Maybe there's a match of 50. I can be the team lead. And then I can also set things like, when did I apply? So put in a date there. When was it approved? When was it executed? When does it expire? So those dates all live in this funding agreement record. I'm not going to talk about those right now. But then this section, we'll come back to this a little bit later, but you can see that out of the $100,000 that I've said this agreement is for, it will keep track of how much I've actually spent. And right now I haven't spent anything, so this is empty, but keep that in mind. So now I've got a funding agreement, a new funding agreement that I'm managing. I'm going to assign it as a, where's my really great grant? As the agreement that I think that I'm going to use for this, one of the agreements that I'm going to use for this project. And you can see that the agreement amount then gets filled in. That's actually coming from this agreement itself. Okay, so now I've got my budget going. I've got ideas about where I'm going to get the funding from. I should say this is a list, so you can have as many of these funding expectations as you want, different sources. I should also say your sources can be internal as well. So if you want to keep track of an internal source as a source of funding, you can put that in the budget as well. Okay, so let's see. Project budget. All right. So that's all I'm going to say about project budget right now. That's sitting now in the background. You can see that I've got no actuals here. All my actuals are 0. So I'm going to collapse this now, and then I'm going to talk about tasks. So the other big thing that a project helps you do is manage tasks. So tasks are your shopping list, right? They're the things that you have to do to finish this project. And when I started the project, I used that task template. And so that's why these are here. So I have these tasks organized in different groups. This one's called project approvals, due diligence, closing. You can, change these names. You can make them whatever you want. This was the template. So again, I can remove tasks that I don't think might be relevant to this project. I can add new tasks that I think I might need to do as well. So tasks have a name, an owner, so who they're assigned to. You can assign these to anybody in the organization. It has a status. And then it has a timeline. So when you use those templates, you don't have a timeline for any of these tasks yet. It doesn't know, when things should be due when you first create a project. So you can manually add these things. So maybe I'll go in here and add this manually. The edit timeline has a start by date and an end by date. You can use one or the other or both. So if you know you have to begin a task at a certain time, you'd use a start by date. If you know it has to end by a certain date, you use that. Or if you think you know the range, you can fill in both. But let's just say I don't know the start. I just know that I have to have this done by some certain date. I can fill that in, end by April 24th. So you can just go through and do this manually for each of your tasks if you happen to know that there are fixed dates that they need to be done by. But there's actually an easier way to manage that type of a timeline editing. And it's this newer feature called Project Timeline. So if I view this project timeline, you can see that now I've got a calendar across linearly across the top. Each one of my goal has its own bubble, and then each one of my task groups has its own bubble. And each one of the tasks then are these smaller bubbles. So if I wanted to say, for example, start my due diligence group at some other date, I can just pick it up and drag it. So maybe I want it here instead. Maybe I want to put my appraisal here, or I know that the appraisal has to start on a certain date and then end on another date. So I can modify all of these task dates right from here in the timeline. And sometimes that's easier to do visually against a calendar than setting it in a field as you go down the list. So you can see then if I back out of this, modifying those dates in that due diligence group have added my timeline dates here into this list. So that project timeline is a nice way to both visualize and also edit the tasks that are in your project. Okay, so what's a task? What's it all about? So I added all these tasks, and I have an owner, and some of them have dates. Depending on your user preferences, these tasks are going to notify you via email that they exist, and then 2, when those dates are coming due. So once you start using projects and assigning people tasks, you may notice people saying, hey, why am I getting all these emails? Well, it's these tasks that are generating those emails. And if you don't like them, each user can change how often they get emailed. And that happens here in this profile menu. So everybody's got a profile that they can edit. All of these alert notification options allow you to determine how often you get emailed about things. Each user decides that for themselves. Okay. So I've got these tasks now. What am I gonna do with them? If I go in and let's say one of my tasks, because this is a brand new project, is perform initial site assessment. Well, if I go into the editor for that task, I've got some more fields that I can see. One of them is a broader description of the task, so you can add those ahead of time too. If a certain task needs more explanation, you can have that in the description. But what I want to point out is it has a required work category and a required work type. And so this is a great way of managing, making sure that when you have a task to do that has a particular deliverable, so in this case, I need a site assessment record proving that I actually did this task. It won't let me change the status to completed unless that work item's been added. So it's telling me right now, sorry, you haven't done the work that's required to finish this task. You can't mark it as completed. So that's kind of nice. So what do I need to do to mark this as completed? I need to add a site assessment. So I can do that from this task down here in the work section. And I'm going to add a new work item. I'm going to pick from my list of available items here. I'm going to choose site visit. And now I've got a new site visit record. I'm going to change the type to assessment, and I'm going to say that it's completed and that I did some stuff. Just to get some data into this, I'm going to add personnel. So this is me out here doing this site assessment. I spent 3 hours. I can pick a cost category in personnel. I'm going to pick general in this case. That's going to it's going to book those 3 hours against my budget. You'll see that as I go through here a little bit later. Expenses, I might add expenses related to mileage. So travel costs, mileage standard, maybe I had to drive 30 miles to do this site visit. It's going to go ahead and book that expense for me there. I might add a form. So I have a project assessment form that I created. Actually, part of this is stolen from a land trust that we work with as well. But so you can imagine that you have certain forms that you use to assess properties, whether you're willing to work on conserving them or not. So this is kind of an interesting way to do that, where you can use actual metrics that you sum up and create rankings for. But this is just sort of an example of the type of thing that you could do on a site assessment form to capture the data that you need. That maybe this is something then that you have to present to your conservation committee or the board of directors to say, here's the evidence that we went out, did this site visit, we've ranked it against our own internal criteria, and this is how it came out. So those forms allow you to do that. So the nice thing then here is I've done my site visit. I can actually generate that site visit report right from here. So if I go to my reports, I've got initial site assessment report. It will take all my data, the landowner information, my form stuff. I can sign it. If I had photos, the photos would be in here, and then a map. And so I could actually use this then as the, convert this to PDF and then send that to my conservation committee or whoever is approving this project as part of the approval process. So I'm not going to do that right now, but that's something that you can do. So I did that site assessment, and I had those expenses added to it. And so now I just want to go back and look at my budget and see what happened to my budget. So now, if I look in the actual column, I've got $150 for staff time and $16.50 for travel. And those expenses came from the expenses that I added to that site visit. So that's how the budget and work relate with each other. If I click on this button, it will show me all the work items that contribute to that actual number, and I can actually click into there and get to the details of each work item if I need to get more details about them. So that's the way that those tasks and work items are related to the budget. I'm just going to go in here again to my task. I'm going to do one more, obtain appraisal. So I'm going to go ahead and edit that task. I'm going to add work, a new appraisal. I'm just going to say that this is completed. I want to point out that each type of work item has its own set of fields up here, unless it's what's called a generic property asset. So certain types of assets, like appraisals, have specific fields that are relevant to them. So who is the appraiser? What's the appraised value? Before, after, per unit value, etc. I can upload the actual documents. So here's an appraisal document that I can upload. That will be available to me later. Expenses. If I want to go ahead and add an expense. So this is, I don't know, first appraisal. Have an expense category, transaction costs, appraisals. That's what I'm going to link it to. I'm going to say there's one. And let's just say this costs $2,500. And now I'm done with that appraisal. I'm going to mark my task as completed. I'm going to go back here and see what happened to my budget. So if I go back to budget, you'll see now under the appraisals line, I have an actual of $2,500, and it's yellow. And why is it yellow? Because it's above what I budgeted for. So it gives me a little bit of an indication that I'm over budget on one of my line items. Again, I can click on that and get right to that appraisal item as well. Okay. So I'm going to go and expand this work and purchase expense section. So now that I know that my property is worth $100,000, I might actually want to put that into the purchase price of the property record. And then when I do that, I have this option of assigning it to one of those budget categories as well. So now I put $100,000 against purchase price. And if I look back up at my budget, you'll see that that's where it went. So again, accounting for all the various expenses as you're going along here. So that purchase price is actually, we'll see the same field as the purchase price field in the property record. So you don't have to duplicate that again. That data is shared in there. So now it's very common, like we said before, that we're getting grant funding or something for the purchase of this property. And this is the section where I would actually put those particular dispersals. So unlike this section in the budget area, this is an expectation. This isn't the actual amount or the actual sources that I've used for particular types of expenses. It's just an expectation for planning purposes. This part here is an actual dispersal, specifically in this case for purchase price. So if I got that grant from that granting agency for $100,000, I can go ahead and tell it that I did that. So if I go in here and I say I got it from state funding, state government funding grant, my really cool grant agreement, let's just say I only got $90,000 from them. And then that's the date I got. Back out of that. So now that goes into my list here for purchase price funding dispersals. This is an actual bit of funding. It's a check that I got, and I said I received it on 3/25, and that's how much it was for. And I'll show you when we get to the property record where that ends up. So funding that you get from various sources doesn't always have to just be associated with the purchase price, right? So some grants may pay for transaction costs as well. And so let's just say I got some money to pay for that appraisal from a different funding source. This work list down here is all the work that's been associated with this project thus far. So even though I added that work in a task, it's still going to show up in here as well. So that appraisal that I added is in here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, go right to the appraisal. And so I said that it cost me $2,500, but let's say I got a grant for $1,000 to defer some of that cost. I can click on this little hand with the $ button, and that will open up the funding section. And again, these are funding dispersals. So I'm going to add another one. And let's just say I got it from that same grant. And let's say I got $1,000 from that. Oops, sorry. Got it from that same agreement. Oops, $1,000. And I'm going to say this was for appraisal. Appraisal. I don't think I spelled that right. No. Okay, so now I have funding tied to that appraisal. And if I wanted to know, for example, how much money have I spent, or conversely, how much money do I have left in that grant, I have a pretty easy way of doing that. If I go back to my funding expectations and I go into this funding source editor again, and then I look at its list and I go into my agreement, the agreement keeps track of all of the funding dispersals that have been tied to the agreement. So you can see that out of the $100,000 that the agreement is for, I have $9,000 remaining. And these are the two places where I've spent that money. So it was the purchase price for the property, and then also that appraisal for the property. So it's a really convenient way of seeing all the money you've spent out of a particular funding agreement. That all gets rolled up to the source level as well. So if you use a source for a long time, you'll see that its dispersals list, it can get quite large. But that's nice because you can always say, well, how much money did I spend from, or how much money have we gotten from that state government grant program? And your number is basically right there. So it makes it really easy to report on that information, or at least find and gather that information. Okay, so that's funding, how it relates to purchase price, and also how it relates to your transaction costs. This work section, like I mentioned before, it's not just the list of all the work that's been associated with the project, but it also gives you a way of adding work that isn't necessarily associated with a task. So maybe I don't have a specific task for something, but I want to book it as an expense or just keep track of something that I did. So for example, in our budget, we care about staff time. So what if I want to say, oh, well, I spent, I'm going to use a general item for work. Let's say I spent, 3 hours doing filing, and it doesn't have an associated task. And I want to just track the fact that I spent 3 hours doing something because I care about how much time I spend doing this project. So I can do that. Again, I can pick a cost category. I'm going to do general again because that's what I've been using. And so that's just a little bit of work that is in here, general filing, 3 hours, and that has been set against my staff time budget as well. So that's this item here. So the project helps you organize and keep track of budgets, expenses, and tasks. It can also help you when you're managing communications with landowners and other folks. So over here, there's a tab specifically for contacts and communications. By default, all the people that are associated with the properties that are in your project are going to show up in here. So Joe Farmer and his contact information are here. Let's just say I wanted to keep track of the fact that I sent Joe an email confirming our meeting for, I don't know, Tuesday, something like that. And I'll say Joe Farmer, and it was an email on this particular date. So I can just keep a record of those communications. If I have a letter or something that I sent them, and it's important to keep the actual letter document, I can edit this communication and upload a document as well. So those documents can be tied to those communications. By default, this filter button is on. These are only going to show communications that are associated with this particular project. But if I wondered, hey, I wonder if I've had any other communications with Joe Farmer about anything else in the past, I can take that filter button off, and you'll see that, yeah, there's a whole bunch of communications here with Joe Farmer, and they're about other things. So I can always see all the stuff that that I've said or sent to Joe that isn't necessarily related to this particular project. But by default, that filter is on. So all I'm looking at is this project. Okay. So as I'm adding those things to this project and working on this project, this latest activity list will continue to get updated. So you can see what people have done. And, was it today, last week? That list will start growing. It will also show me what are my upcoming tasks. I don't have anything this week, but if I switch it to month, I don't have anything this month either. We can fix that. Change that. Okay, so now my upcoming task is in there. So at a glance, when you just come into the project details page, you can see those upcoming tasks right there. So that makes that convenient. After you've collected all this data, or you're filling in this data, oftentimes you'll want to report things out in various ways. So maybe the board needs an update on this project, or you've got to bring information about it to a committee. You can create report templates and generate those reports right from this page, and that's this button here. So for example, if I wanted to create a report for the board on the budget and expenses related to this project, I have a template for that. So you can see that basically it's printing out the budget table, and it also is listing out all the various work performed and what the costs of those things were. So I could save this as PDF or print it out on paper. It's a nice way of summarizing the costs of the project. Another example might be a project status report. And this also has this budget variance table, but it also has the funding expectations, and it also enumerates all the tasks and their status in the project. So that's maybe another visualization or another view you might want about this project. Okay. So let's say I've completed the project now. We're done with it. We've done all of our tasks, and the property is protected. First thing I might want to do is actually mark the project as complete. And then I'm also going to want to go in and finish up the actual property record itself. So it's easy to navigate to any target records in the project. If you go to this little building blocks button and click on that, you'll see that all the target records are listed in this list. And there's my really great property. I'm going to click on that. It will take me to the property record. And so if I'm done, maybe I want to change the status now to either current holding, could be something else, partner holding, depending on the circumstances. But now I've marked it as current holding. And the nice thing then about working through the project with all my stuff is that things like, let me go back, sorry for scrolling. Things like purchase price, that field was already done for me because of the project. Purchase price funding, that's all filled in for me because of the project. I've got some communications in here related to communications that I added in the project. But the big thing is going to be the assets list. So if I go to assets, you'll see I've got my appraisal is there, that general work is there, that site visit is there. So again, all the food made its way into the refrigerator. And that's really cool. And that's the purpose of the project. Like I said at the very beginning, if you didn't want to mess with that project stuff at all, if you just wanted to upload these things piecemeal, you can totally do that. You could just be working in the property record. You can upload your assets right to here. You can fill in all those other fields here. You don't need a project. A project is just a tool that you can use to help facilitate planning to manage the acquisition of your properties. Okay, so I think with that, I will stop and open it up to any other questions that you might have. Or Michael, did I miss anything? Do you want me to show anything that I missed?
I don't think so. I think that was really great. Maybe goal geography. I've heard some people talk about wanting to see, hey, we're talking about a building envelope on the property, or we want to be able to see some of the things we're working on a map on the property, different zones in the property. Can you talk about goal geography?
I can. Are there any other outstanding questions that need to be answered from the audience before I move on to that?
Kathleen would like to know, can you show how to make a project or task template?
Sure. So Michael, I think I'm going to defer your question to an audience question instead. Sorry. Okay. So yeah, so templates for anything are done from the home screen, and you go to reports. And I'm not going to actually talk a ton about doing this. I think we might even have a training coming up just on templates, or maybe I've wanted to do one. I don't know. But we could do a whole hour just on editing templates. But this is what that project template looked like that I showed, or one of them at least. And the key thing about templates is they have a category. So that category needs to match the data that you merge into them. So in this case, it's a project template. That's important. The other thing that makes this template a little bit more advanced is it has this concept of nested, repeated content blocks. And this is why it can get to be a really long conversation. But it basically, each one of these repeated content blocks is a list of things. So in this case, this list is goals. And inside the goal, there's budget variances. And there's also this one down here, which is work. And so that's the complicated bit. Otherwise, all you're doing is picking fields from this list to show the data that you want to show. And that's basically it. There's a lot of functionality in here. I don't think we have time to talk about it all. But at some point in the future, we'll do a whole training just on report templates, and it will be awesome. Michael, anybody else that I missed?
Let me see. Can you enter budget and expenses funding dispersals without doing a project?
You can't add a budget. So a budget is pretty much the only thing that you can't do without a project. Funding dispersals for anything you can do just in the property record. So for example, this would be your purchase price funding in the assets list. If you wanted to have funding for that appraisal, you can add that right here. We're still in the property record. Pretty much anything else, tasks even. I didn't talk about this, but when you're pretty much anywhere in any record in landscape, you can click this button over here and it will show you a task list. So in this case, it's filtered for this property's tasks and ones that are owned by you. You can add new tasks here. So you can actually add tasks that aren't associated with a project. And they can be managed in that way outside of a project as well. So really, the only thing that a project adds in terms of other functionality is the budget. And then, of course, it brings it all together for you in a nice interface. But otherwise, everything can be added directly to a property record if you want.
Let me see. Kathleen wants to know, where do you set the category and category item for expenses?
Where do you define them, or where do you? Okay, so you define them in settings. So all these things are in settings. If I go to work, I'll just go with, everything's right on this list, so I'll just go through them all. So all those checklists, those task checklists are defined here. So if I look at that one that I defined that I used, you can see you're basically just building the task groups and the tasks. If you want to set required work items, you can do that here. So that's how you build checklists. Budget templates are in here. It's the same thing, basically. You're just building the budget and giving it a name. Forms are here as well. And then cost categories, this is where all that information is coming from. So labor is a special thing, cost category that is tied specifically to those personnel lists. So that's kind of special. But otherwise, you can create whatever categories you want and add the items that are in that category. You can give them a unit and a default unit cost. There's actually a lot of other functionality in here. That could also be another topic, but you can do submaterials and all kinds of things. So if you're doing restoration projects for stewardship, this can get real complicated. So keep that in mind too. That would be another training. Is there anything else? Otherwise, I can show goal geography.
Austin just asked, by changing the mileage amount, does it reflect on all properties? Would it be best to do a mileage 2020 and a mileage 2021, for example?
So so back in cost categories here, this is just the default. So when you so changing this isn't going to go and update anything at all. So any data that already existed that was using this category doesn't get changed by modifying it here. This is just what the new default will be going forward. So I don't think it makes sense necessarily unless you find yourself needing to add expenses from past years that maybe had a different amount, but you can change those in the expenses themselves anyway. This is just a default that can be overridden in the actual expense. So, for example, I was in the that appraisal record, or just this general filing, for example. That's a good example. Or what was the one with mileage? Sorry, that was the site visit. Okay, so if I change that mileage amount, it's not going to change this. But if I wanted to, I can type whatever I want for the unit cost in this expense. It doesn't actually matter what the category default was. It will still do this calculation and it will apply it to that same category. Okay.
Cool. Margaret says that she would like to see goal geography as well.
All right, goal geography. Okay, so goals have their own geography, and you can edit that geography by going over into your map layer. And so why would you want to do goal geography? Well, like Michael said, sometimes you may want to point out specific areas on the map that are pertinent to this goal. I have a harder time thinking of a good example for property acquisition. Certainly for restoration projects, this could make a lot of sense. Like if you want to define an area that you're going to be working in, you could, for example, edit the goal areas layer and then say, okay, that's the area we're working in, and I'm going to give it a different color. Do that. Hello? Okay, fine. Can give it a different color. And give it a name and say, this is where we are working. And then I can add photos and whatever. That geography will also show up in my templates if I want it to, and other things. So I don't know if anybody has a specific example of when they would use it for a property acquisition. I guess maybe if there was maybe an excluded area, or maybe like a possible excluded area or something like that, you could use goal geography for that, maybe. I guess.
Yeah, so both Nancy and Mike mentioned, Nancy said, where would you draw in the building area? And Mike said, what if you want to document on the map negotiations regarding the location of a special use area?
Yeah, and then ultimately, that goal geography, if you were using goal geography layers for that, ultimately you need to get those into the property record. So the goal geography doesn't currently go into the property record. So once you're done with the project, if that were the building envelope, you would have to either export that out and import it into the property record property layers, or have another way of getting it in there. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to see that in the property record itself. That is the one place where that connection doesn't exist. So Kathleen asks, I think I saw that, what happens to the project when you close on the easement? So a project just has a status, and so you can change it to complete. And basically, if you have views or you have reports that are just showing you active projects, they're going to be doing that filtering based on this status most often. And so the project is just done, and it will always exist in landscape. If you ever wanted to go back and take a look at what was there as far as tasks and things like that, you can always get back to it. I wouldn't suggest you delete it. So just use the status as a way of showing it or hiding it, depending on where you're looking. The fact that the property is something that you actually hold now, that occurs as a status change in the property record itself. So if I'm looking at the property, this is the status that really matters for that. And so most of the time it's going to be current holding. If you were doing it as an assist type project and you never actually held the interest, it would be a partner holding instead. But that's basically what turns that switch at the property level. And so I just want to point out too, you can see from this building blocks button again, what projects this property has participated in. There's no active ones because I marked that project as complete. But if I change it to complete, you can see, oh yeah, it was in this project. So I do have a way then of navigating back. If at some point in the future I wanted to see what project was associated with this, I can navigate to that project record right from the property record there. So, all right. Any other questions, comments?
Mike would just like to know how one would document on the map various proposals for the location of a special use area. So I think I've recommended before to people, if they want to propose multiple lines, to use actually the goal lines and to put the information into goal lines. Could you have multiple goal areas, Caleb?
Yeah. I mean, that'd be another way. Yeah. So right. So you could instead, maybe this is proposed zone 1. And then if I go back here and edit this layer again. And maybe this is proposed zone 2. So I can use these fields in here, and I can even label them as such, so that helps me. So zone 1, and then I'll label this one zone 2. So that gives me a way of documenting multiple potential zones here as part of that process. And then ultimately, when you decide on one, you could always delete these. You could copy that geography or export it out and import it into the property record as the final building zone. So yeah, you could use this as a scratch pad in that way. All right, any other questions for the remaining few minutes we have here? I'll just take a minute and just say, if I switch back to the dashboard here, you can take advantage of the new feature for dashboard layouts, that you can have multiple layouts now that you can switch between on the dashboard. And this layout, for example, is one that we threw together that has more property acquisition related stuff. So this one, for example, is showing me the most recent communications, like in the last 2 weeks for projects that are active. This is that task list as a timeline view in the dashboard as a widget as well. And then I just got a map as well that will show me where all my active projects are. So you can really tailor that dashboard to make it useful to your particular work. So if these are the types of things that are important for you to see on a day-to-day basis, customize that dashboard and make sure that that information is showing there whenever you log in.
Yeah, and I'd also like to mention we're hoping to get some of those dashboard templates available to you as built-in dashboard templates sometime in the near future, so you don't have to build them yourself.
Right.
So look for that coming.
Coming soon. Coming soon. All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'll just give you another 5 seconds if you have them. And if not, thanks everybody for your time. I really appreciate it. And we've got another one coming up next month on, Michael, what is it? Mapping?
Mapping, yes.
Mapping.
The most popular one. Everyone's really excited about mapping.
Right. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah.
And thanks again, everybody. Have a great day.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone.